Replacing your chain and sprockets to go from this to this isn't as hard as you might think. It's just nuts and bolts. Follow along.
Here's how you can tell when to replace your sprockets and chain. Notice these grooves, how the teeth are nice and fat and these troughs aren't too deep. Now let's take a look at the old sprocket. We see that these troughs are dug out much more and the teeth are much sharper. That's how you know the sprocket's worn and it's time to pop on a new one. Now, what about the chain? Looking at these axle adjusters, you can see we're slid all the way back. So if we have too much slack in the chain and we're slid back all the way, we're done. Also note this adjuster. We're threaded in almost all the way. Looking at the front sprocket, we want to be sure we replace this lock washer behind the nut as well. Those are pretty much one-time use items. Here's your parts list. You need a new rear sprocket, a new front sprocket. You need a new rear sprocket bolt lock tabs. Notice those, again, one-time use. You can only bend them over and then bend them back one time. Same for the front, a new lock washer behind it, and a new nut. Getting them both in a kit, it's pretty cheap off eBay or something like that. And you need a new chain. I'm using a nice rubber O-ring chain. They don't stretch as much as standard ones. One of the biggest questions I get is where to find parts for motorcycles, especially old ones. You might call the dealer and they say, oh, this hasn't been made in 35 years. What do you do? So this is what you do, especially for an old bike like this. If you're here in the United States, go to partzilla.com, select the bike you're working on. In this case, I'm working on a Yamaha motorcycle, a 1974 DT250. Let's say I want that front sprocket. So you just pick the one where it is. It might take a little looking. I'm going to go to transmission. Here I see the counter shaft, and here's our front sprocket, lock washer, and lock nut. Our front sprocket is 34, part number 34. So we go down to 34. Maybe it's available, maybe it's not. Wouldn't you know? It's 13 tooth, and it's available to buy. So I could buy it here for 14 bucks if I want to. Whether it's available here or not, what I generally do is highlight the part number, copy it, go to eBay, type in what you're looking for, and then the part number, and search. Sometimes you'll find it for the same price but with free shipping, or you might even find it cheaper. Right? You could find a new old stock one cheaper, or you might find an aftermarket replacement that's cheaper as well. Here we see that sprocket. You want to make sure that it's the same number. Sometimes eBay will change it just to try to get you something close. This isn't a Yamaha part. You can see it's Caltric, but nevertheless it's 14 bucks with free shipping. So we could go ahead and order this right now. Let's keep looking for our other parts, like our chain and rear sprocket. So we'll go to rear wheel. We see our rear sprocket is 29. Bingo bango, 43 teeth. There's our part number, but it's unavailable. And if we look at the top here, we see there's all these other sprockets of different tooth counts that are all unavailable too. That means that different versions of this motorcycle, the DT250, the DT360, came with different teeth rear sprockets, which makes sense. So you want to be sure you're getting the right one for your application. So it could be stamped on your sprocket itself, or you may have to count the teeth. Either way, we can pick any of these. We copy, and we simply go back to eBay, paste, and search. And then we find these sprockets. Now it said nothing came up, but it gives us things that are close. In this case, we see that we've got a 44 tooth one. So maybe you want 44 tooth. Maybe you want 48 tooth, For chain, the chains are easy because they're all generally the same except the length. So number 32 is our chain. Let's go to 32. We see that it's a 520 chain, 104 link. So we just need to buy a 520 chain of 104 links. But I usually buy longer, right? I usually buy longer because I want to give myself extra wiggle room, and I'd rather give myself a longer chain and then cut it down. So we need a 520 chain, and you're going to want to buy an O-ring chain. I like DID. Here is a DID 520 chain and 112 links. That means that we are way more than enough. We could even come down a little bit. Remember, we needed 104. We could even come down to 110, and it'll probably be a little bit cheaper. It was $1 cheaper. Surprise. It's as easy as that, guys. There are still ways to find parts for these old motorcycles. Nearly all of them can be found, if not new, on sites like this or the dealer, then on eBay. Bend back that front sprocket lock washer with your choice of specialty tool. Here, I'm using a Craftsman screwdriver that will most definitely be exchanged at Lowe's for a new one when I break the tip off. Once bent back, grab your impact, or throw a screwdriver in the chain to keep it from rotating if you use a normal socket wrench, and zip off that front sprocket nut. Now we remove the master link on our chain. If it's a clip-on style versus the rivet style, I simply turn the wheel until it's on the sprocket, so we do need the back wheel off the ground, or just hobble it along. I like to hammer it off with that same flathead screwdriver I used earlier, rotate the wheel backwards a little bit to give you clearance behind the chain, and then slide out the chain link. Easy peasy. Now simply pull that old chain off the wheel, take the front sprocket off, and fit the new front sprocket on. Now replacing the rear sprocket is a bit more involved, but definitely not difficult. We just have to pop off that rear wheel. Guys, check out this sad excuse for a cotter pin. I don't know what it is, but it's bad news. The front was the same. No bueno. Now we just disconnect everything. Remove the brake actuator rod, pop off the torque arm. Now we're going to loosen the lock nut and back off the axle adjusters really far. That way we have a lot of wiggle room on this rear axle. Now after you zip off this axle nut, wait, pause, just hold on a second. Take note of any spacers in here. There's going to be washers, spacers, these adjusters, and it all goes in a particular order. And when you pop this wheel off, all of it will fall down onto the ground. And you're not going to remember the order, so take note of it. Take a picture of it. That way you remember. Depending when this axle was removed last, you may have to dead blow it a little bit, use a punch. Either way, don't worry. You'll get it. Eventually, you'll be able to pull it out, and that rear wheel will be in your arms in a tender embrace in no time. It's a good idea to solve the problem of why this axle was so difficult to come out. It's all grimy and solidified, and any grease that was on it is now rock solid. So go ahead and spray some brake cleaner or your solvent of choice on it, wipe it down, and then what I like to do is take it over to my bench grinder and use the brass wire wheel on it. That'll remove any of those surface imperfections, above the surface that is, and then re-grease it before putting it back in. That way you're good to go next time you want to pull the wheel. Now it's time to take off that rear sprocket, so these locking tabs need to be bent back down so that you can back off these bolts. To do that, I'm going to use, you guessed it, the most versatile tool in my shop, the flathead screwdriver. Is it a chisel? Is it a pry bar? Is it a back scratcher? All of the above. With all these bolts zipped off, clean up the mating surface a little bit, and then you can fit on the new sprocket. Now take your new lock washer tabs that you bought, lay them out over the holes, thread in the bolts by hand to get them started, and then zip them in, being sure that you tighten them down to torque. On this particular old bike, torque values are just based off of the size of the bolt. I believe this one was about 45 foot-pounds. Not super tight. Now to bend these tabs up, you gotta do what you gotta do. The method that I found that worked for me on this particular bike with this particular sprocket was getting these tabs started, just lifted a little bit with a chisel, and then coming in with the flat punch and finishing the job, making sure that it's bent up really tightly around that bolt. You need it snug and secure, that way it really locks that bolt into place so it can't turn. Now before you throw your wheel back on, you want to be sure that you grease everything up. So take off the little covers if it has them, or spacers on both sides of the wheel, making sure that they're clean and greased. With your axle adjusters in place and your shaft nice and lubricated, you're going to want to grab your dead blow hammer again and smash it into place. Now wait a second, because on the other side we have that spacer. I like to wait until the axle shaft is just poking through like a little turtle head, until I grab that spacer, put it on the other side, and then finish the job. Important note, if you don't have the perfect size chain, if you're taking a longer chain and cutting it down to length, you want to be sure that you slide these axle adjusters all the way out. That will push the axle and wheel all the way in, allowing you the maximum amount of adjustment backwards as that chain stretches over time. If you start with these adjusters halfway and you cut your chain to length, you're only giving yourself half of a stretch, so to speak. For our front sprocket, be sure you grease the splines up really nicely. Put on your new front sprocket, your new locking washer, and in this case, I'm using a new nut. You don't have to use a new nut, but sometimes they get goobered up because people just use breaker bars on them and stuff, so might as well, they're cheap. When you look up the specs of your bike, I'm sure you'll be able to find how long that chain is. Is it 110, 114, 106? Number of links. That's what that number means. What I like to do is usually buy one that's a little bit longer. The reason is because I don't really know what I'm getting into on these old bikes. I don't know if I'm using the original sprocket sizes. I don't know if something's been changed. I don't know if somebody else put a different rear wheel on that's bigger or smaller. I like to get a few links bigger than I think I need, and then with my chain cutting and riveting tool, I just cut it down to size. That makes sure that I don't have to send it back and get a new chain. But with that being said, if you're sure that everything is stock, the sprocket sizes, the wheels, then go ahead and get the same length chain that you think you need. That way you don't have to cut it down and you can just hook it right up. Guys, don't cheap out on your chains. You can get a $22 chain off Amazon for pretty much any motorcycle. The problem is it's junk. It's going to stretch so much. You're going to have that back wheel off the ground and those axle adjusters cranking them down every couple weeks, especially if you're hard on it. So pony up. Spend the extra couple bucks for a nice DID O-ring or X-ring chain. These nice chains, and it doesn't have to be gold, right? And that's just for fancy guys like me. These nice chains last so much longer and they stretch so much less over the same amount of time. That means more time riding and less time adjusting your chain. If you do need to cut your chain down, be sure that that wheel is all the way forward and those adjusters are all the way out like we talked about before. Make a little Sharpie mark on the rivet that you need to pop out. Now, a DID chain cut and rivet tool like this is a buy once, cry once type of situation. It's about $115, but trust me, if you're going to do your own chains, you need it. This can do rivet style master links, it can break chains, it can do it all. And I'll throw the link to this down below. For tools like this, you always want to be sure that you keep the instructions. The reason is because if you're only using it once in a while, you're going to forget how to put the tool together, how to assemble it based on what you want to use it for. So after reading the instructions, you know how to put it together, you know how to set it up, and then it's just a matter of cranking it down to pop that rivet out. And now it comes time to find out if you are a hero or if you are a zero. It should line up absolutely perfect. Oh, thank goodness. Whew. Now, depending what type of master link your chain came with, either a rivet style or a clip style, go ahead and put in that master link to connect both ends. I honestly prefer the rivet style. I know the clip style doesn't need a special tool like this DID tool, but the clips are pretty tricky to get in. You have to squeeze it together really, really hard and then grab a pair of pliers or needle nose or special master clip pliers like I have, which makes it a little bit easier, but not a whole lot easier. It's sort of nicer just to press that rivet in. But either way, this is a clip style master link, so we'll just clip it in. Done. Bingo bango. Now to adjust the chain tension. Step 1 is to ensure that your adjusters are in the exact same position on each side. So grab a ruler and measure to make sure that you're starting with a nice straight wheel. Step 2 is to put a wrench on the adjuster bolt and tighten it in 1/2 turn increments at a time. Half a turn on the left, half a turn on the right. Do this 4 times on each side to start. So 4 half turns on the left, 4 half turns on the right. Then check the tension. As you get closer to perfect, you're going to reduce the number of turns to only 1 or 2 half turns at a time. To dial it in, you may need to go to 1/4 turn increments. That's how close and precise we can get. But ensuring that you're turning them equally on each side will give you a nice straight wheel at the end. Every bike has a different chain tension spec, but 1 to 1.5 inches of deflection upward, measured at the middle point between the sprockets, is a good benchmark. Like so many other things in life, if it looks good, it is good. So get behind the bike, make a line of sight down that chain, and spin the rear wheel, watching for how that rear sprocket feeds the chain into the front sprocket. It should be nice and straight. You'll know because you'll see if that rear wheel is crooked or canted to the side. The last tip I'll give you here as you're reassembling everything is how to adjust that rear drum brake. I'd like to just lift that rear wheel off the ground still, spin it freely, and then tighten down that rod adjuster. Just until it starts rubbing, until you can hear it rubbing on the brake shoe. At that point, back it off just a little bit. That should be it. And then spin the wheel, feel the brake pedal, spin the wheel, feel the brake pedal. But if you tighten it down to where it's rubbing and then back it off a couple turns, that should be right on the money. With the back wheel attached, we can turn our attention to that front sprocket. We wanted to wait until the chain was on because we have to tighten down this countershaft nut. To do that, we can't have anything spin. So what I use is this little sort of sprocket jammer. It's called by Motion Pro. I'll put the link down below, and you just put it in the chain or on the sprocket, and when you turn, it jams itself in. It's made of soft aluminum, so it doesn't hurt anything. But you can stick a screwdriver in the chain. Heck, I think before when I was younger, I even just put a literal rag in the chain, and that gets jammed in the sprocket, and it works, right? But the wheel isn't going to be enough because even if that back wheel is off the ground, it's going to skip, right? You just won't be able to tighten this countershaft nut unless you jam the sprockets with something. Now that that nut is tightened down, the last thing to do is keep it in place. So with a punch and a hammer, we're just bending over those tabs on that new lock washer, and then we're good to go. Now, listen, have I reused these lock washers? Have I just hammered them back and reused them once or twice? Yeah, I have, but I do that on my bikes. On other people's bikes, I just buy a new washer, right? So what am I going to recommend to you? Buy a new washer.
And of course, the last thing to do is to wax your chain, to grease it, to lube it. Just follow the directions on your can. Thank you guys so much for watching another episode of Two Car Garage. We'll see you in the next one. Thanks.